The Vikings didn't discover America because they were brave explorers. They discovered it because they were following fish. Cod, boring, bland, ugly cod, led to the discovery of new continents, 3 actual wars between modern nations, and a $3 million auction for a single tuna. Fish built more empires than gold ever did. And now, we've eaten almost all of them. Hey, I'm your host, and on Object Origins, we dig into the everyday objects and resources that secretly shaped our world. Today we're talking about something you probably see at the grocery store and never think twice about: fish. In this video, you'll discover how cod drove Viking expansion across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus, why Basque fishermen might have kept the biggest geographic secret in history, how 3 armed conflicts erupted between NATO allies over fishing zones, and why a single tuna sold for over $3 million while we've already destroyed 90% of the ocean's large fish. This isn't just the history of fishing. It's the story of how protein you could preserve without refrigeration rewrote maps, started wars, and built economies that still exist today. And stay for point number 5. It's the part that made me realize we're living through the end of something that took humanity thousands of years to build. Let's start with the Vikings, because this is where the whole story begins. When you think Viking exploration, you probably imagine dragon ships, warriors looking for new lands to conquer, maybe some romanticized idea of adventure. But the reality is way more practical and way more interesting. Vikings were following cod. Cod migrate seasonally in massive schools through the North Atlantic, and Viking fishermen learned to track those migrations. The fish led them to Iceland first, around the late 800s. Then Greenland. Then, around the year 1000, a place they called Vinland, which we now know was North America, specifically Newfoundland. Here's the thing that blows my mind. Cod made those journeys possible in 2 ways. First, it gave them a reason to go. Abundant fishing grounds meant wealth and food security. Second, it gave them the fuel to get there. Dried cod, which the Norse called stockfish, could last for years without spoiling. No salt needed, just air-dried on wooden racks in the cold northern wind. It was portable protein that didn't rot. That's what allowed multi-week ocean voyages in open boats. Gold and glory make for good stories, but it was salted and dried fish that actually moved civilizations across uncharted water. Now here's one of my favorite historical mysteries, and it connects directly to that Viking cod story. Basque fishermen, from the region that's now northern Spain and southwestern France, were some of the best sailors and fishermen in medieval Europe. And there's compelling evidence that they were fishing off the coast of Canada decades, maybe even a full century, before Columbus ever set sail in 1492. They were chasing cod. Why don't we have definitive proof? Because they likely kept it secret. If you found the richest fishing grounds in the world, the last thing you want is every other fishing fleet in Europe showing up to compete. Some historians point to the fact that Basque fishermen seemed unusually well prepared to exploit the Grand Banks, the shallow underwater plateaus off Newfoundland, almost immediately after Columbus's official discovery of the New World. They had the ships, the skills, the drying and salting stations ready to go. It's possible they'd been quietly making that trip for generations, keeping the coordinates to themselves, because cod was worth more than gold if you controlled the supply. Think about that for a second. The history of fish trade might include one of the greatest kept secrets of the age of exploration, and it was kept not by kings or explorers, but by fishermen who just wanted to protect their business. Let's zoom out for a second, because by the 1500s and 1600s, dried and salted cod wasn't just food, it was a strategic resource. European powers needed protein that could survive long sea voyages to feed sailors, soldiers, and enslaved laborers in colonies. Cod fit that role perfectly. England, France, Spain, Portugal, they all fought over access to the North Atlantic fisheries. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland became one of the most economically important places on the planet, and it was entirely because of fish. Catholic Europe had another reason to obsess over cod: religious fasting rules. For much of the year, Catholics weren't supposed to eat meat on certain days. Fish was allowed, so cod became the protein of choice for millions of people across the continent. Entire port cities, like Bristol in England or Bergen in Norway, built their wealth on the cod trade. And I'm not talking about modest trade. This was industrial-scale fishing and preservation, centuries before we had the word industrial. Cod wasn't a luxury. It was a staple that powered navies, fed colonies, and filled the hulls of merchant ships that connected continents. And here's the key point that connects back to those Viking voyages. Fish that doesn't spoil equals power. It equals reach. It equals the ability to project force and people across distances that would otherwise be impossible. Fast forward to the 20th century, and cod is still causing international chaos. Between 1958 and 1976, Iceland and the United Kingdom fought 3 separate conflicts called the Cod Wars. Not metaphorical wars, actual confrontations involving naval vessels, net cutting, ramming, and live gunfire warnings. This was NATO ally versus NATO ally, and the issue was fishing rights. Iceland's economy was heavily dependent on fishing. As industrial trawlers from Britain and other nations began vacuuming up fish from waters Iceland considered theirs, the Icelandic government started expanding its exclusive fishing zone, first to 12 miles, then 50, then 200. Britain refused to recognize those boundaries and sent warships to protect its trawlers. Icelandic Coast Guard ships would cut the nets of British trawlers. British frigates would ram Icelandic vessels. It got intense. Here's the wildest part. Iceland threatened to leave NATO and close a critical Cold War naval base that the United States used to monitor Soviet submarines. Overfish. And guess what? Iceland won. Britain eventually backed down, and the 200-mile exclusive economic zone that Iceland pioneered became the global standard. Today, virtually every coastal nation claims a 200-mile EEZ, and it all traces back to these confrontations over cod in the North Atlantic. Fish changed international law. Let's switch species for a second, because cod isn't the only fish that rewrote economics. In Japan, bluefin tuna is cultural treasure and culinary obsession, particularly for sushi and sashimi. And the prices reflect that. In 2019, a single bluefin tuna sold at Tokyo's Tsukiji market for over $3 million. One fish. The buyer was a sushi restaurant owner making a statement, but that price tells you something about how valuable these animals have become, and how rare. Because here's the grim turn in this whole story, the part I mentioned at the start. The same fish that led humanity across oceans, that fed empires, that triggered wars between modern nations, we've nearly destroyed them. Studies suggest that industrial fishing has wiped out roughly 90% of the ocean's large fish since the mid-20th century. Cod stocks that were once so abundant you could supposedly walk across the backs of fish in the North Atlantic collapsed in the 1990s. The Grand Banks fishery, the one that shaped 500 years of history, closed in 1992 and still hasn't recovered. We built our ability to explore and expand on fish that didn't spoil. And now, those same oceans that once seemed infinite are empty in ways that would have been unimaginable to a Viking fisherman or Basque captain. The fish that carried us to new worlds are vanishing from the same seas they once filled. So let's bring it all together. Fish, specifically cod, but also tuna and dozens of other species, wasn't just food. It was the protein that didn't rot, which meant it was the fuel for exploration, the backbone of empires, and the economic engine for entire regions. The Vikings followed cod to Iceland, Greenland, and America. Basque fishermen may have discovered the New World before Columbus and kept it secret to protect the history of fish trade. European powers built economies and fed armies on dried cod. Iceland went to war 3 times with Britain over fishing zones and won concessions that redefined international maritime law. Japan turned tuna into a multi-million-dollar auction spectacle. And now, in our lifetimes, industrial fishing has removed roughly 90% of the large fish from the oceans. The same resource that opened the world to human civilization is collapsing under the weight of our demand. That's the story written in scales. Fish built our capacity to go farther, discover more, and connect continents, and we've nearly fished them into oblivion in return. If this changed how you see something as ordinary as fish, hit that like button and subscribe to Object Origins, because we've got a lot more stories about everyday things that secretly run the world. Next up, natural gas, the history of pressure that built and broke nations. Trust me, you'll never look at a stove the same way again. I'll see you in the next one.